Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anthony Painter. I'm Chief Research and Impact Officer here at the RSA, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event. I'm delighted to have the chance today to talk with Pippa Grange about her book, Fearless, How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself, in which Pippa shows us how, by starting to live with less fear, we can find deeper fulfillment. And if we're honest with ourselves, there have been moments for us all where fear has held us back. I don't mean the odds of phobia, but what Dr. Grange describes as not good enough fear. It holds back communities, institutions, maybe society as well. And given the scale of the challenges we individually and collectively face, we can't afford to be held back. Now, Dr. Grange is a sports psychologist and a culture coach working across elite sports and business internationally. She's worked with some of the biggest names in sport and business. As head of people and team development at the Football Association, she worked closely with the England team for the World Cup in 2018. Pippa is now part of the senior leadership for the global Right to Dream group, working on cultural strategy. Thank you for joining us, Pippa, and I'm very excited to dive into this fascinating book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
That's an absolute pleasure. Now, let's just start at the top and, very, very broad. And obviously your book goes into some depth on these questions, but what is fear, and what's the impact of fear on our lives? What does fear state do to motivation and performance, and what triggers it?
So we'll start right at the top.
Yes.
For me, fear, I describe fear as an emotional energy. It is a very natural phenomena, a very natural response phenomena that is triggered when we feel threat of some kind, and threat in its broadest sense that I'm sure we'll go into a little bit in the conversation. What it does to us is basically, we can look at this from a number of angles, but, I think that the main thing that I talk about is that it steals our joy, keeps us small, and puts us in a place where we're much less willing to take risks than we might otherwise be. And it's risks that are risks of some kind that are the juice of life. And I feel that we quite often don't recognize how hijacked we are by not good enough fear. It shows up in sneaky ways and disguises itself as other things that we might not recognize so readily. And I think that the great objective here is to actually learn how to turn the volume down on the amount of not good enough fear that's sort of coursing through life, and feel like we have a few more options of how we might like to experience our successes and failures without that sort of shaking fear in the background.
It's an emotion I'm sure we all know well. And, obviously, the timing is an interesting one, because here we are, almost a year and a half into a pandemic. And obviously there's been quite a bit of fear about. And I was reading your book, which I think there's abundantly fascinating sort of insights into our psychological makeup, stories about ourselves and others that come together and really open out the topic very well. But there was something nagging at the back of my mind as I was reading it, that actually fear may have had its uses in the past 18 months or so. In the context of a pandemic. And I was thinking of my own personal experience where, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was due to go to a wedding, and I felt a degree of sort of loyalty to go to the wedding, and I felt a feeling of shame that I hadn't have gone, but it was actually fear that prevented me from going as the first lockdown was happening, in case I was the cause of somebody else catching. I was living in London at the time, and someone else catching COVID. So you can see that fear actually in certain circumstances has its uses. Is it always a negative thing? Or even at a societal level, can it sometimes be a positive?
Absolutely. You raised such an excellent point here. I wrote the book actually just before the pandemic. I couldn't have foreseen what was coming, and I wish I'd had the opportunity to sort of include some thoughts on that. But something that I do talk about is that fear, we don't want to be without fear. The book is called Fearless, not Fearless. Fear is very useful, very natural and very useful. And I make the distinction between two types of fear. One is in the moment fear and one is not good enough fear. In the moment fear is where something is actually threatening you. Something is actually in front of you, you're facing down a choice of something around something where it does involve risk and a threat of some kind. And the example you describe of trying to make a difficult choice between, your value of loyalty and the value of not causing harm or putting other people at risk is a perfect example of something that would stir up in the moment fear and be very real. So it can look like that, or it can look like a sort of immediate fear response, as you drive around a corner too fast and reach for the brake quickly and you get a prickle of fear. That's also in the moment fear. And both are utterly rational and utterly necessary. We do need them at a personal level. And I believe at a cultural level, they guide, they motivate. The problem is that they can be way too amplified. And if we're not noticing what kind of fear space we're in, it can take over quite readily. It's quite contagious.
Yeah. And I guess that sort of in the moment fear, as you describe it, has its uses, but they can quite quickly turn in on us, as and again, just because we're in the moment of the pandemic, and hopefully we emerge out of it. We've now got the spread of vaccines, and there is some hope about the future, no matter what the short-term context might be. But I wonder at some point, for many, whether that fear has become debilitating. We haven't yet sort of reckoned with what the changes have been to our sort of psychological makeup as a result of this past 18 months, and what might have been a very healthy fear to begin with might actually, for many, have become debilitating in ways we don't quite yet recognize.
Yeah, I really agree with that on a couple of levels. Firstly, in terms of sort of, anxieties born of the length of time we've had to be very vigilant about something that's actually really threatening, genuinely causing us angst. And it's been we've had to habituate our behavior around it, whether that's the vigilance of sort of, precautions like hand washing or wearing masks, the vigilance of staying apart from people, and habits form relatively quickly. So I think that there's some undoing and unlearning of those habits that we'll need to contemplate as we come out of the pandemic, hopefully. But the other thing I notice in terms of the amount of time that this has been going on, and I mentioned before that fear often disguises itself, or it's expressed as something that we find we can deal with more readily, and anger is one of those things. Yeah. So Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, actually used a brilliant expression she called anger the child of fear. And I think that we are seeing lots of anger and blame and the sort of need to land that emotion somewhere as sort of a very strong sort of sense of other people being wrong or you being right, and a strong sort of sense of communal anger. And I think that at the root of that is a lot of the fear that we're talking about that's built up, and we haven't quite known what to do with it.
I love that child of fear quote. It really touches on something, doesn't it? And I think, we might come back to some of how it relates to politics and fear a bit later on in our conversation. And one of the things that you talk about in your book is around this sort of concept of sort of having a sort of scarcity mentality. There isn't enough to go around. Opportunity, resource, success, love, happiness. And that can breed a sort of, a will to dominate, or a sense of competition where it's not necessary to have that. What do you think this sort of mentality does to our relationships, whether they're professional or personal or otherwise?
I really think that they drain our relationships. Relationships need psychological space. All kinds of relationships need psychological space and presence. And fear, the scarcity mentality that's associated with fear, takes us in the opposite direction. Things become urgent. We feel the need to conclude or to make certain or to control. They're all associated with this idea of there not being enough to go around, whether it's, professional success or whether it's something sort of, broader than that, as we think of love or, community, space within communities, community connections. When we allow ourselves to absolutely work and live at full throttle and be in a constant race, constant performative race, scarcity is bred very quickly. The idea of climbing the ladder, the idea of needing to reach the top, scarcity is at the root of each of those things. The idea that you'll run out of time before you've done it all. And I personally think that destroys our psychological freedom, our mental freedom, and the ability to really deeply find contentment or to enjoy the successes that we do have in life. It's not that I don't appreciate goals and the benefit of the motivation of goals and having, dreams and ambitions, so to speak. But I think that when they go along with a feeling of scarcity, now or never, it's this window of opportunity or it's all over, I think that they really take us away from the full experience. And they take us away from performance, actually, too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, your background, well, part of your background is in sports psychology. Do you ever have a sort of ambivalence about sport as a wider metaphor? Because, of course, I'm probably completely misunderstanding it. The thing about sport is, the rewards are quite scarce. You either win the medal or you don't. You win the race or you don't. You win the league, or you don't. It has a very clear sort of structure and form. It's why it makes such great metaphors, because it's very applicable to wider challenges and wider life. Do you ever have ambivalence about what we can learn from sport and translate into our wider perspectives on life?
I really love that question. I have many ambivalent days, but what I've come to understand about sport is that what we see as sport now often is something much more like a commoditized event. And what sport actually is an expression of our humanness. The playing of sport is an expression of our deep ability to compete or to endure or to test our mettle in some way. Whether that's, against self, against the clock, or against each other. And there's something beautiful in that. And I sometimes find when we talk about sport now, we talk about the professional edifice of it, as this sort of product or commodity. And for me, when I have those ambivalent days, I go back to my understanding of what it actually is and does. And when I think of it from that perspective, I still love it. I still find the joy in it and the point of it and the worth in it for us as a human species.
The sense of belonging and community, which of course is so rich,
right.
And is one of the few ways in which we can all mainly come together.
Yeah, and that's actually not inevitable. There are many times where sport's actually not inclusive, or for all our glossy view of it, creating belonging, that's not inevitable. We actually have to choose that as a way of doing sport and being in sport and allowing sport. Sometimes sport's a volatile environment for negativity, and so, I think it's really important that we choose how we approach sport and what we allow in sport and what we want from it. It can be equally a negative, exclusive environment as it can be something character building and amazing. We have to choose the process ourselves.
And of course, there has been a controversy running around players taking the knee in protest at structural racism. And one of the things I read recently that really sort of impacted me, and I thought was a brilliant piece of writing, was actually by the England manager Gareth Southgate, who wrote in response to the criticism the England team were getting for taking a knee. And I've got the quote here. It says, I have responsibility to the wider community to use my voice, and so do the players. It's their duty to continue to interact with the public on matters such as equality, inclusivity, and racial injustice, while using the power of their voices to help put debates on the table, raise awareness, and educate. There was something quite amazing that was happening in that articulation, because what Southgate seemed to manage to do to me was to articulate a version of patriotism that was quite demanding, actually, and was insistent that actually there isn't a world called sport and sportsmen have to play over there. We're all part of a national community, right, and we all have political voice. And actually, if we have a position and a role, we almost have a duty to highlight issues of deep concern. So what was interesting in the context of fear, I think, and it must have been quite a fearful moment, I think, maybe for Southgate or some around him, maybe it wasn't for Southgate, but what it seemed that he's doing, he was confronting fear in a very assertive way, but a very articulate way that I think opened out a different sort of space for this debate.
Yeah, I agree. It was a clear and articulate expression of how he sees his responsibility. And I think that, the viewpoint there that I would share is that sport belongs to the fans, to the people. It's not something separate. And as to my point before about it being possible for it to be the best expression of our humanity, like the arts. In fact, it is something then that we have to treat with care and take responsibility for. So you don't get to sit in this separate bubble with a separate set of rules, and you definitely don't get, if you're a fan or it's an observer of the game, you definitely don't get to assume a right that the people who play and the people who are involved in it are some kind of commodity, some kind of entertainment avatar that don't have the right to civil opinion. They absolutely do. Even if you didn't look at it from a perspective of duty or responsibility, which I'm pretty sure Gareth would, you can look at it in terms of, well, that's actually every player's workplace, and they have just as much right to any kind of civil comment, and especially on something as injurious as racism, to which they have been subject many times. So, I feel very strongly that we don't carve them out in some way as separate to the rest of the rules of society.
It's been fascinating the past year or so that seeing some of the most interesting public leaders stepping up in a moment of national crisis have actually been some of the players in and around that England team, some of the clubs. Marcus Rashford is the obviously one that springs to mind. And there seems to be a generation of young sports people coming through. And you see it not just in the male version of the game, you see it in women's football. We've seen examples in tennis and tennis stars demanding that they are treated with a greater degree of respect. But it seems to be a generation of sports people coming through that seem to be embracing this wider public persona. And it must be a difficult thing to be the first one to do that. And you think about in the past and some of the things that some sports people experienced in the past, homophobia, racism, and so on, and didn't have a voice in that process. There's something very powerful going on in confronting fear, but then opening out wider public engagement as a result.
I think that's probably true of young people generally. there's a cultural shift towards sort of a more realistic and a less fear-driven culture that they want to create for the future and that they're prepared to live in. And that's wonderful. That sort of, especially in sport, that sort of hyper-muscular, tough it out, take it on the chin sort of mentality. It just doesn't wear anymore. It is not now and never really was a sound culture. And I'm really happy to see that start to change. And I think that groundswell is coming from the top as well as sort of, the public and sort of bottom up. I just noticed before our conversation today that there was a bid by the German Football Association and football team to actually be able to light up their stadium at the next game with the rainbow flag as they play Hungary in protest to the anti-homosexual laws being passed by Hungary. So, when you see something like that, you can see the power of sport, and you can see the power of that sort of different rhetoric, that different tone that's coming mostly from young people speaking up without fear and just speaking truth as they see it. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Is personally, the reason I still feel hopeful every day is that I think that there's a lot of thirst for that change.
There is not quite within UEFA. It would appear who apparently have tried to block it, but you don't have to express an opinion on that. That's my own personal opinion. But if you want an institution that is woefully out of date, then UEFA might not be a bad place to start.
But when you look at that, don't you think that it's becoming abundantly clear where those woefully out of date institutions are?
Yes.
Because that public conversation is getting stronger with more voices of authority figures or respected, credible figures, as you mentioned, even Gareth, on racism. The people who are not keeping up institutionally or otherwise are becoming really apparent and not cool.
Absolutely not. Now, in your book, you talk a lot about sort of winning shallow and winning deep. Do you want to talk us through those ideas in a little more detail?
Yeah. I make the distinction because after sort of, 25 years in the field working with sort of very high performers who were, by any of our reckoning, extremely successful, I noticed time and time again that there was I just use the word tone that went with a lot of high performers that they couldn't really feel or experience their success and their wins in any deep way. As soon as the trophy was in their hands or the deal was signed or whatever kind of performer we're talking about, they were on to the next thing. They never actually felt any fulfillment or any sense of being enough. And the term I coined for that was that they were chasing shallow wins. It never actually felt like it hit deeply. It was never bone deep in contentment. And I think that those kind of wins usually come where we're chasing something only for self, that's about personal gain. Where it is a do or die mentality, a scarcity mentality, as we spoke about before, and where there is sort of a deep sense of urgency that's associated with it. So again, back to our sort of eternal foot race to the top. Those wins, in my experience, working across many elite athletes and business performers, from sort of boardroom to boot room, was that they don't feel good. They feel shallow and empty and vapid. And then there's the alternative, which is the deep wins, where usually there is something in that is about more than you. It's a connected feeling. It's an experience of winning that comes from somewhere deep, at a soul level, as I say, that feels both earned with blood, sweat, and tears, but it feels like it has real meaning beyond just the trophy in your hands. So, they're not as easily, you don't come across those as readily as some of the shallow wins, perhaps, because they require, it might be the same event or the same outcome that you're talking about, but they require a shift in perspective from us to really feel that you're working on something purposefully.
What I found interesting in the book is that, and I think it's because of the sort of the winning frame, if you like. And I think you quote, I think it's Mark Epstein on sort of desire is reduced. You use a lot of sort of terminology from the sports world, but then you turn it into something more soulful, as you're describing, which is the winning and deep mentality. And I was sort of wrestling with this sort of an ambivalence for me of this sort of idea of the limitless self. You can challenge yourself and relentlessly perform better and wider and deeper, but knowing full well that it's our sort of limitless desires that are having all sorts of negative consequences, not just for us as individuals, for society and the environment we live in as well, but equally not wanting to sort of put ourselves in a position as humanity of not being able to achieve ever greater things as part of a more sort of a wider, embracing, communitarian humanity that can reach out above and beyond and not just have those shallow victories. Can you help me navigate this sort of tension a little? Because I think you do it quite well towards the end of the book, and then I got it. And I think just a bit more of a sort of guidance as to how we can prevent going to those sort of the sort of narrow victories into a broader embrace of something which is worthwhile and meaningful.
Well, I think that we navigate this on two levels. There's the personal, which is about really finding a sense of something that's meaningful for you. And I say that, without being trite, but quite a lot of us find ourselves on a performance treadmill with lots of trappings of success, but we're not actually feeling very successful or very fulfilled. And that requires some sort of fear-inducing truth about what you're doing with your life and your precious time, and who you're doing it with. And whether you're actually experiencing any sort of meaning in that, and whether you're climbing the right ladder, so to speak. And that's an individual journey. And I talk in the book about some of the ways that help you access that as well. And really sort of coming back to the idea of what you desire, and like understanding or unpicking what your dreams are without it sounding fluffy and esoteric or something we thought about when we were younger, but we park them as soon as we hit 30, sort of thing. And it's that's I think there's real richness in going back to your truth authentically and understanding where you are today vis-a-vis that sort of truth. And that requires sometimes a little trip to the underworld and to sort of, have a look at what the reality of your life is and whether that feels successful to you rather than against the cultural grading system that we have around success. Because that's a really interesting journey and not a very easy one for lots of people. But I think that's really important. The other thing, though, is to recognize the cultural zeitgeist that we're in around success and winning and fear and what good enough looks like, and how deep a hold perfectionism has on the way that we live. Perfectionism, consumerism, how they actually shape the way that we think and the narratives that run us, the ideas that run us. And I think if we take the time to go a bit deeper on those, then, a lot of those narratives have fear, have a little dark spot of fear right in the middle of them, a lot of those ideas. And, they're the ones that we should stop and challenge and stop and ponder. I'm not saying every single one is wrong, but have we actually thought about the ideas and beliefs and narratives that run our life, and where fear shows up in them? And when we can unpack a little bit of that, suddenly there's more space to make choices that feel more purposeful or stronger for you. And then they're not necessarily dramatic. Sometimes they're small shifts, but they're really, really fundamental, even if they're not huge.
Well, you've done a lot of work with investing in opportunities for women and girls. And in terms of those sort of cultural expectations, of course, expectations around appearance and how that can weigh down. We talk a lot about purpose. Of course, society can choose in a narrow way purpose for people, often young women and girls, and the feeling that they have to look a certain way, be a certain way, and so on. How can we most? I mean, it's difficult. You're alone and you're bombarded with these cultural expectations through the commercial world, media, social media, most particularly. How can we start to change that script, do you think?
I think lots of people are working on that and doing great work on that. But, for me, it comes back to the idea of worth. Like the only reason that there's a distracting sort of set of ideas about women's, how women or girls look is because we have an idea that that's the center of their worth. And, when we can, move that to the side and actually come back to what a woman or a girl's inherent worth is, and she can understand that. And she can bring that to the table with confidence, then I think that's a huge step forward. A focus on the physicality. It's actually not just women anymore. I think that's very increasingly prevalent for men, but it's been a long history of that for women. It's not that that's bad in and of itself, but it's distracting from worth. That's really got very little to do with an individual's value. And that's the shift that we have to make so that people can understand that they're, that they won't be rejected if there is some kind of less in that respect.
Yeah. And it also plays out on the sort of the stage of status as well, doesn't it? And, we come with these sort of enormous, very impressive brains to help us navigate the world in a variety of different ways, socially, cognitively, so on. But they've got a lot of flaws to them. And if there's one bit of wiring, that, fundamental wiring I could correct, it's kind of this inherent desire for sort of status. That I think leads to this a lot of the sort of corrosive behaviours that you're describing, and the will to dominate. How do we start to confront the sort of tyranny of status in our lives? Because it does drive towards sort of fundamental exclusions.
It does, and for me, my lens on that is a cultural one, and I think that we're obsessed with status because we fear rejection without status. It is a fear at the heart of status, the need for status, the need for power. It's fear at the heart of it. And that's why I focus on fear as the topic rather than status or any of its manifestations. At the end of the day, the more we can have our hand on the volume around fear, the easier we're going to be able to navigate something like the need for status. So it's like the secondary symptom, if you like, of the central issue, which is being too fearful. And, for me, the design flaw in this incredibly complex brain that we have is that we have maybe just a half-second difference in the speed of processing between our old, what I call in the book, our old circuitry, that includes the amygdala, and the newer circuitry of the prefrontal cortex that allows us to reason and be rational and contemplate life. It's just a little bit slower than the old brain. And that causes immense amounts of complexity and difficulty for us, because the old circuitry is much more interested in survival and power and being safe, and preservation. And the new circuitry is much more interested in contemplating possibility, contemplating the possibilities. But it's just that one step behind. That's a little bit of design flaw I would fix if we could.
Got to get a new circuitry to catch up a bit.
Yeah.
And of course, advertisers, marketers, they're all onto this and have been for generations, right?
Yeah.
But so are politicians. And I think in the book you referenced the go home vans that were sort of sent out around North London. And of course, obviously, what that's designed to do is sort of induce a sense of fear and a threat to status, and to then mobilize that fear for political gain, and domination, to use that phrase. And it's problematic because it's not just around sort of winning power or not. It starts to structure the very way we think about our world, the type of policies that we're willing to accept, the type of things that we are willing to think as reasonable, and in the worst circumstances can take us into ever more extreme positions. How can we start to confront that?
The thing I talk about throughout the book is it starts with seeing the fear, right? So for both the reasons that you just outlined in terms of how culturally manipulated fear is, but also because of the design flaw that we just mentioned, we do actually need to pause just a second, half a second actually, and notice, to just see when fear is there. And what I talk about is seeing it and then facing it before you try and do something about it. And, if there were one thing I could encourage people to do, it's just hold their ground for that tiny little second longer to notice what the emotional experience they're just having is. Because so often it's actually fear rather than, as we said, anger or frustration or irritation at somebody else or disgust or all sorts of other things that then manifest in a whole set of ideas and narratives that shape our life. It's so often just that little extra moment to recognize it's fear that is there. Fear is in the room, and then face, how is this showing up in my life? So, what is this costing me? What is the cost of this idea? And whether that's individually in a marriage, for example, or in a relationship between a father and son, or, in a work relationship, or if it's a cultural, institutional, political position that we're talking about, it's the same stuff. What actually is present when we react that way? And we just need to just hold that tiny bit longer, which, that's the courage in the work, but it's also just about knowing that that's going on constantly, that we're constantly tripped into this recycling of that strong, powerful emotion of fear.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's interesting you referenced the workplace in the conversation here as well, because of course, fear-based environments, and they can be very subtle. I mean, we don't necessarily talk about not necessarily talking about a sort of sweatshop culture, or the high octane culture of ultra alpha male environments in 1980s sort of financial institutions. But what seems like a perfectly reasonable workplace and well-meaning can often harbour a lot of fear in many respects. And in order to confront that, it might be necessary to display something which I think you discuss at points in the book around sort of vulnerability. But the problem with that, and I think this applies no matter what your seniority in the organisation is, it's a big risk if you're new in an organisation, for example, and you don't want to seem that you're not competent or you're weak in some way. You fear that you might be exploited if you show vulnerability. But it actually applies at the other end of organizations as well. Even those with power may not be able to communicate what is concerning them, or why they're acting in certain ways, or even to open out a conversation around how they're acting in certain circumstances, for fear that their vulnerability could be used against them. How can organizations, and some of the organizations you work with may have confronted some of this, start to cherish vulnerability, but then also expect that a response to vulnerability is other people reaching out and supporting and seeking to understand and respond in an appropriate way, rather than try to push it away in some way, or even worse, crush it?
Yeah, I totally agree that the other end of the spectrum of like those with the most power, those who seem like they actually have it all together, are equally strained when it comes to showing vulnerability. And there are a couple of things that I think are really important in the unlocking of this. And one of those is intimacy. I feel like this term intimacy has been sort of co-opted far too much as something that just is part of families or happens between partners. We think of intimacy in very narrow ways, but actually intimacy is just about, being able to show up as you, authentically, mask off, guard down, and perform from there. Respond, interact, relate from there. And the fact that it feels terrifying tells us everything we need to know about the kind of culture that we're living in and have created. But, vulnerability can also be contagious. And when we can show up intimately and just not filter quite so much, not put ourselves in that strained position of worrying constantly about the impression we're making on the other and whether we look good enough, which is at the heart of all of this. Things free up in tremendous ways that generally elevate performance massively, and that feel so much better because you're actually in a relationship rather than a performance dance. And that's so central. And I think organizations can go so far with this. I give an example in the book of an Australian rules football team called Richmond Tigers, who did a Triple H exercise where they wanted to introduce more intimacy, and they each staff member, but each player, starting with sort of the captain, had to stand up in front of 45 other guys and tell a story of a hardship, a highlight, and a hero from their life. Now, these are guys who go out and crash into each other, and they couldn't be more tough in a traditional sense, but they were absolutely terrified about doing this because it was intimate, and nobody had given them parameters on what the kind of stories they brought, but that it was they to a person brought vulnerable stories. They brought intimate stories about family and about history and about experiences, and the sharing of just stories of who they were as humans. And the commonality of that created such an extraordinary relational bond and sense of knowing each other beyond the mask, that their performance, that was one of the catalysts for their performance lifting tremendously. And it doesn't have to be Triple H and sort of a scenario where you stand in front of your colleagues and talk about, heroes, hardships and highlights. But the idea of, how could you show up at work tomorrow and give more of your story, give more of yourself, and when somebody says, how are you doing? And you say, I'm good, thanks, move on. Or, yeah, good weekend. So it was nice to get the sun out, and something superficial. What if you made eye contact? What if you stayed 5 seconds longer and actually related to the person in front of you and the conversation that you were having? That's what I mean by intimacy. It's actually very small. Small acts of relating can absolutely break open performance in organizations or teams, on or off the pitch. And I think we underrate it massively. It's an unlock to vulnerability. It's a partner to vulnerability. And that for me is just it's got reams of possibility in terms of performance, but also fulfillment.
I think you're going to have provoked a lot of hardship here and highlight conversations in many companies across the country, if not beyond, following this conversation. So, how big does this get? You know, you talk a lot about sort of writing new stories, telling new stories, that to see and face the fear, as you described it earlier on. You know, what does this open up, not just for us as individuals, but for us as a society? You know, could it open up wider and more accelerated change as we, for example, confront inequality or climate emergency? You know, is fear at a sort of societal level holding us back, preventing us from making some of the big changes that we need to make? And one of the stories I was struck by in the book was the example of Amin Nima, and apologies if I mispronounced that, but they which is a neighborhood in Ghana where a footballer basically unlocked the community sort of capabilities and assets by highlighting not on their impoverishment, but on what their capabilities were in. And they did this through sport and music and art, and it restored sort of a sense of confidence and mobility and energy to the community. Obviously, that's at a relatively small scale. But can we use this way of approaching things to harness much bigger change, the type of change that we need?
Yes, but I think that the Amanima example, and King Jan is one of the founders of that project. You know, the example there is perfect because it's a small start in a local sense that escalates. So, you know, when somebody feels moved by that shift, that sort of lowering of the fear and elevating of the possibility or the sort of renewed sense of themselves, that is equally contagious. That spreads, right? So, you know, I think sometimes we stand back with arms crossed and frustration at who's going to fix things, who's going to make these enormous sort of social changes that we absolutely need to make and that we're facing into. And, you know, my invitation would be for people to start much closer to home in the ability to relate to your fellow man in a re-envisioned sense of what it is to be human. When we say common humanity, what's common? How do you know if we don't relate? You know, how do we actually know each other? I think that so much is vested in relationships in terms of how we do from here, you know, as a society. And when we relate, we care. When we care, we'll make change. And so, you know, coming back to that, turning down the fear and opening up enough to create relations, create relationships, for me is you know, has an abundant power in it to do amazing things. And, you know, I'm kind of no longer waiting for somebody else to sort things out. Brilliant if they can. But I think, you know, psychologically, there's much stronger work we can do close to home that is very, very powerful.
When we relate, we care. When we care, we can make change. What a brilliant note to unfortunately finish our conversation on, because we're out of time. I guess the sentiment is that we are the people we've been waiting for, but it is about we and us.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. You'll find links to Pippa's book, Fear Less, not Fearless, but Fear Less, in the chat here and on the RSA website. And if you enjoyed this discussion, you might want to check out some other RSA videos in this arena. For example, Brené Brown's illuminating talk on empathy. Thank you again, Pippa, for joining us, and thank you all for watching. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to be with you.